All right, so I'm gonna do an interview on Dad, Shantibaba, about mainly about hash and just some questions about it, as I have a school project. So, all right, Dad, is there anything you'd like to say?
Good evening.
Yeah. All right. So my first question is, what are
Oh,
the
I mean, good afternoon.
yeah,
Sorry.
you're
Evening.
good. What are the different types of hashes?
Well, there's quite a few nowadays, but basically there's the old traditional one, which is the dry sieve, which is just using dried biomass over a screen and hitting it or shaking it or agitating it. And then there's a water hash, which is usually in 2 degrees or less water, the temperature of water. And you soak all of the biomass in and you separate it with silk screen. Then there's the butane extractions type of things, butane, um, and basically they're using solvents. And then there's the fresh frozen, which is cutting the fresh plant, keeping it in a frozen state, very fresh, and maximizing the terpene and resin production by superheating it in between like a hot press.
Is that also known as rosin?
That's a rosin press and fresh frozen. Yeah, there's different ways to make them, but basically that covers most of the different types of processes nowadays.
Yeah, and charas.
Charis, obviously, that's one of the last most uneconomic forms of making hash. They're coming from the living plant while it's in the middle of the day where it sweats, and you do it by your own hands, and the amount that you take is incredibly small, but it is the champagne of the hashes, probably.
All right. How is dry sieved hash made?
You basically dry the material, the plant. You cut the plant, you dry the plant for at least 3 months. You de-stem it, you take it off the wood, you crush it up basically, not too fine, and then you put it over silk screen. And the resin that comes off is usually around 74 microns silk screen. The one that drops in is usually the neck and the head of resin gland, and that's the powder. Once you heat it up and you press it, it becomes dry sieve hash.
Okay, and how is charas made?
Charis is comes from the living plant, so while it's in the ground still, usually in the middle of the day, where the hottest part of the day, where the plant gives off like a small sap, like a honey type of material, and you rub it, and you don't take any of the green leaves or anything. You have to keep cleaning your hand, but the resin sticks to you. The resin starts sticking to the resin on your hand, and basically it's a very slow process, but it's like a living hash, and it's made usually when the plant's still alive.
Um, and how is bubble hash made?
Bubble hash is usually made, and it's usually made at 2 degrees or less in water temperature, usually in a very cold environment, and the principle is that the resin gland becomes very brittle and snaps off, and it separates in the water from the green biomass and drops. You have a like a bag with a silk screen at the bottom of it, and another one catching, and basically you're using water as a solvent to separate the resin from the biomass.
And
Then you
butane.
dry it and then press it basically. Yep.
Okay. So is that kind of similar to butane hash oil where you use a solvent?
No, well, so they're very harmless solvents. You know, water
Yeah.
and air is basically not really what you consider a solvent. But then there's the new extractions like butane extraction, ethanol, alcohol extractions, all different types. Basically, what they do is they strip off the resin with a reaction to the solvent, so it strips it, and then you have to take off the solvent, and you have the separate compounds. So you have the biomass in one area, and then you have the resin in another. the advantage of some of those, like fresh frozen, for example, where you cut the plant, you keep it in a freezer, so you don't actually dry the plant, so it has a lot more terpene, a lot of more flavonoid flavors and stuff, and you will keep the integrity of all of it. Rather than drying the plant, you're losing certain amounts of that, and then
So
you make hash. So
is that with the butane hash oil where you get to keep a lot of the terpenes?
yes, well, not just butane, but say fresh frozen would be the technique. Instead of drying it, you freeze it, and then you put it through a different extraction, butane, water, whatever one you want. But they usually do butane. Or,
Right.
you can do soak everything in alcohol, and then purge the alcohol off and separate the gunk, which will be the hash, and the biomass, which is a very, very good way of stripping everything off the plant in one time.
Is
alcohol.
that like the Rick Simpson oil?
Yeah, yes, very similar to that technique.
So rosin is like the process after the fresh frozen.
Yeah, well, rosin's it's basically a hot press. You know, when you make, when girls straighten their hair with the straight, it's a very similar process to that.
So that's like almost dry sieve hash.
It's more like
but it's really high temperature, or
yeah. If you do it with fresh plants, almost like a charis resin,
right?
Because you've got all the flavors, all the terpenes. That's like charis is you're taking it off the fresh plant, so you've got the full integrity of the terpene, and then you get the obviously all the cannabinoids and stuff as well.
Okay. How does climate influence hash production?
The same way climate basically generates a good crop or a bad crop of anything, like grapes, of olives and that. So if you're in an area which is traditional for say grape production, and you have the right soil and you have a good season, you'll get a lot of very good grapes. If you have hail at the wrong time of the year, you get no crop. And so climate is everything basically in an outdoor crop.
Okay.
However, we use greenhouses as well nowadays to avoid losing everything from outdoor crop.
But is there like specific temperatures that make that kind of influence the hash, or just the crop that?
Yeah, well, if a plant, I mean, there's several aspects to consider. Firstly, you have to make sure that you pick a strain that makes very good resin production. Not all strains are the same. Some make 6%, some make 15% of the weight. So, and then you look under a microscope and have a look at whether they're full resin glands, like a head and a neck, rather than broken resin glands. There's many influencing factors to do with that, but that's like a winemaker. Everyone can start with the same Nebbiolo and Shiraz and Riesling and blend it together, but not everyone makes the same wine. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Are there specific traits you look for in strains for hash production, and if yes, are there different traits that you look for different types of hashes?
Yeah, well, there's if you're breeding, like many times we've had companies come to us and they're looking for a high yielding, strong resin production. And there was one company that came to us for a strong terpene production. So when you're looking, you have to use laboratories to do the testing, but what you can do is, say, traditional marijuana maybe had 7 to 10% THC. Now we look for varieties that maybe have 22% THC and maybe 4% terpene. And then we separate all of those ones, and then we test for further on and see which ones are commercial hash making varieties that produce very good results. So it's trial and error, but once you find it and you keep it in a clone form, you can replicate the clone and produce the same material year after year.
Mm-hmm. What are some factors that influence yield in terms of hash production?
Well, the strain, first of all, the cultivation, the farmer, the experience of the farmer, the ground, the temperature, sunshine, the hour's light, oxygen content, altitude, and aspect. So very similar kind of things to wine and olives, for example.
So what would you specifically look for when you're trying to increase your yield?
Well, when you're looking for like a purpose grow, which is what I consider to look for traits that fit to those purpose grows. So if you're looking specifically to make a strain that is very good for resin production, say maybe you're making a medical grade hash for for the market, and you want to make sure that it's economic. So you need to get at least sort of 10 to 12% return from the crop, because otherwise it makes it very expensive to produce. So most varieties would make when you dry out the material will make between 6 and 15%, and not more. So you make 150 grams of resin powder from a kilo of green flowers, basically. And it's depend on the quality and what you want to do, but you can make less and make it more pure. But usually, it's around. The question was, how do you make a more yield for?
Well, yeah. Before you were talking about for dry sift, you're saying, if you agitate the resin on top of the silk screens for a longer period of time, you get more hash.
So I mean, every technique has a different way. But for example, in Morocco, they would split so they have 100 kilos of green material. The first bang, they put it through a silk screen. They maybe do 100 grams at a time, and they do it for 10 seconds or 30 seconds. And they take the powder away, and then they put it back, the same material back in, and they maybe do it for 1 minute. And then they take the powder away, and then they maybe do the same material again for 2 minutes. And then, so they've got 3 different qualities. And the pressure that you put on it to try to get the material out, how long you expose it to the silk screen for, the humidity.
What processes in the production of hash do you find similar to the production of wine?
The processes? Well, they're parallel agricultural practices, basically. I would also include not only that, but I mean olives as well. I mean nearly everything. But let's say wine processing, you start with a base product. So like, for example, you start with a Nebbiolo grape and a Dolcetto grape. But once you have grown it in the aspect and the geography of where you're growing it, and you've made it into a fermented juice, the bit that now becomes the vital part is the wine maker, the blending of the curing, the storage, the percentage ratio is all it's down to the person who's actually making it. It's similar to the hash maker, whereas they age it, they dry it, they cure it, then they do a sort of very small maybe a small dry sieve, then they maybe blend the water hash with the dry sieve to make it hash. So the actual person who's in control and understands the process of both wine and one of making hash have very, very similar jobs. Yeah, they've definitely, that's where the magic happens, I believe. So.
Do you think there's a bigger stigma around the production of hash and hash in general compared to wine?
I don't think many people really understand the processes of cannabis and how things work there, but they assume they understand the process of alcohol because it's been around longer. The stigma is usually to do with the unknown factor, and because it's been stigmatized as a drug form for quite some years before, but in actual fact, it's so much less harmful than alcohol. I mean, if you put it in the danger of drug ratio, I would say alcohol is probably the most harmful drug that we have legalized, and tobacco's up there too. I would say cannabis is well under both of those two. So, but you know, I'm an advocate for cannabis, so I've always used it in a responsible way. But I don't know how to use alcohol in a responsible way. You know what I mean? Maybe one a glass or like that. But
all right, then I think that's the end of it. That's all the questions I have. Thank you, Dad, and yeah, I appreciate it.
Welcome. Good evening.